It's an important shiur as far as what to do when you purchase your arba minim this year. I haven't checked yet with the local merchants what merchandise they're going to be selling, but we do need to take a look. We do need to take a look and see what the issues are. Obviously, you understand that this year there's a unique challenge that happens once every 7 years, and that the produce that's grown in Eretz Yisrael has Kedusha Shvius, has Shemitta status, and that raises a whole number of potential problems. The first thing I'd like to cover with you is this article that was just published a few days ago on Aretz Sheva, Israel National News. The article's headline is, Israeli four-species farmers threatened by Shemitta ignorance. And it says that ignorance of laws of sabbatical year means many Jews falsely believe they can't buy from Jewish farmers. Damage could be irreversible. Now, anything that you read on the internet is immediately suspect. So let's remember that. Just because it's on Aretz Sheva doesn't mean that it's gospel. The first thing that I would be looking for is, if I was reading this, I would be looking for a rabbinical statement and the name of the rabbi and the body that he represents. That would be the first thing. But let's see. The article says, in advance of the upcoming Sukkot holiday season, Israeli distributors of the four species arba minim are predicting that the Shemitah sabbatical year will take a very heavy toll on their sales due to widespread ignorance of the laws pertaining to Shemitah. This despite well-known and commonly accepted halachic adjudications that allow for the purchase of Israeli-grown produce. Okay? And of course, the next paragraph talks about what four species we're talking about and why you need it for Sukkot. And it says then, despite the religious mandate, which requires that farming be curbed this year, leading religious authorities approve specific measures to allow for the purchase of four species grown in the Holy Land, and in so doing ensure that consumers help limit the economic damage to Jewish growers and distributors and the Israeli economy as a whole. Like all produce grown in the Shemitah, the sale of the four species is supervised by a highly respected rabbinic court which ensures that the sale takes place outside the restrictions of the Shemitah year, a process known as Otsar Beistin. Now, that term Otsar Beistin may be familiar to you if you were in attendance at one of our shiurim over the course of this year having to do with the laws of Shemitah. I believe we had 3 separate shiurim on Shemitah, and in one of them, the third one, we discussed what Otsar Beistin is. I'll just review it very briefly, because we need to re-examine it in light of the purchase of arba minim. Otsar Beistin is a principle that finds its source in the Sifra. It's quoted by the Ramban and by a number of other Rishonim, who talk about the following din. We know that when you have produce, vegetables and fruit, you're allowed to consume them during the Shemitah year, even though they grow during Shemitah, provided that it's before Zman Biur, provided that it's before the time when they have to be removed from your house. And when do they have to be removed from your house? When they're no longer available in the field, right? So every fruit and vegetable is seasonal depending upon the species in question and also the region in Eretz Yisrael in question as well. So, you could have fruit growing a little bit longer in one place than in another place, but as long as it's still available to the behema out in the field, you're allowed to take Shemitah produce, bring it into your house, and consume it to your heart's delight. But once the Zman Biur arrives, once it's no longer available out in the field, it's past season, you have to remove all of the Shemitah produce that you have in your house. There is one exception, and that is, what if the Beistin takes possession of all of the produce of your field? Then the halacha is, says the Ramban and a number of other poskim, that the produce is no longer subject to biur. It no longer has to be removed, destroyed, or anything else. And it is treated like hefker, just like any other Shemitah produce that was permitted before the Zman Biur. Otsar Beistin allows that produce to be permitted even after Zman Biur. And as such, it still is hefker. You're not allowed to buy and sell it But what the Beis Din can do is it can hire workers who will harvest that produce, keep it in warehouses, and then when they want to unload it to the consumer, can give it away and only charge the labor and harvest costs, but not the cost of the produce itself. And that's the principle of Otzar Beis Din, and that's what Ruba Deruba of Eretz Yisrael relies on today, with certain exceptions within the population. We had learned that the Badatz Yerushalayim does not wish to rely on Otzar Beis Din, and that's one example, and there are other examples as well. Now, how does the principle of Otzar Beis Din help adjudicate the problems of Lulav and Esrog? The article does not indicate that. Now, certainly, it would alleviate one issue, which is that if the Esrogim have been harvested and we're already past Zman Biur, if that is the case, then it would be permitted to still have and own Esrogim in my home and to use for the mitzvah. That certainly would be okay. But how does Otzar Beis Din alleviate some of the other issues that we're going to see are potential problems? That the article does not address. So we have to keep an open mind. Finally, and only in this paragraph does the article say that it's from the Eretz Chemda Institute in Jerusalem, issued a specific ruling detailing the Jewish laws permitting and even encouraging the purchase of Israeli-grown produce in the Shemitah year. Okay, and then the rest of the article goes into what kind of loss the farmers are anticipating. It also discusses what some consumers are going to be doing, buying esrogim from Morocco and from other places. And it even quotes a friend of mine, Steve Berger from Los Angeles, who's very active in making sure that esrogim from Eretz Yisrael are brought into the United States. And that's the article. You can read it on your spare time.
Is there a reason why, I mean, maybe it's just the verbiage the way the writer wrote it, but the sale of the four species, when it only pertains really only to Esrog?
Well, why does it only pertain to Esrog, Robert?
Well, isn't that the fruit?
That's the fruit. So you're right. But the assumption is that if a person's going to buy his arba minim, the main thing that the moicher makes his money off of is the esrog. You can buy the esrog. The lulavim come from Egypt, by and large. Hadassim and aravos generally are not shipped from Eretz Yisrael. The hadassim, I think, are, but the aravos aren't. Aravos are brought over locally. So the one, you're right, the one that has the most impact is the esrog.
Well, because he says the sale of four is supervised by...
So
he's specifying all four.
But the esrog is the major issue, as you correctly surmise, because it's a fruit. But the article is not enough for us to be able to paskin as scholars that it's okay. We can't just rely on this article to say, now I can go buy arba minim from Eretz Yisrael. There are a number of issues that we have to raise, and you'll see that there are at least 5 different challenges that I've itemized for you. And by the way, the conclusion of our research is going to tell us that absolutely it's okay to buy arba minim from Eretz Yisrael with certain provisos, okay? But the question then is there a compelling argument to say that now that it's Muttar, then it is the preferred thing to do? And then you get into meta or extra halachic issues of you have to support the Israeli economy, especially the farmers in Eretz Yisrael. There's an overriding concern, and even if there may be some level of really minor inconvenience, it's certainly justifiable in order to invigorate the agricultural economy in Eretz Yisrael. That's going to be the conclusion of our shiur tonight, but it's nisht pashut. It's not as pashut as the article implies it to be, which is why we would classify this article under propaganda. Now, propaganda is not always bad. Sometimes there's good propaganda. This is a good piece of propaganda to support the farming agricultural community in Eretz Yisrael. But it oversimplifies a very complex issue, and it's not just out of ignorance that some people may choose not to buy an esrog from Eretz Yisrael. There may be halachic considerations that are real, and that we'll see were undertaken by even some of the 20th century poskim. So let's look at the potential problems. Number one, when is an esrog considered to be from a Shemitah year? at the time of its growth or at the time of its harvest. Yes?
Sorry, so if the rabbis buy this produce from the farmers, they're not actually buying it from the farmers, they're just paying for the transportation.
Yes, the farmers are not being paid for the produce.
So then
What a farmer basically does in a Shemitah year, he consigns his field over to the basin and says, Basin, you do with my field what you wish. The basin this is the way Otzar Basin is supposed to work. How it works on the ground, I'm not privy to, I haven't witnessed it myself.
They lose so much money.
What the basin is supposed to do is they now take possession of the field, they hire the workers, they plant the crops, they let things grow, and they harvest it, and they take it into their possession. It becomes totally the possession of the basin.
But then the premise of supporting the farmers isn't really a good premise then.
Well, the reason it's a good premise is because ultimately there are people that the basin hires who are the migrant workers, who are the people who are farming the field. So even if a landowner, in theory, is not going to get paid, which, by the way, this whole project that Agudas Yisrael was engaged in was paying farmers to consign their fields over to Otzar Basin. At least a portion of that project over this past year was raising funds so that farmers would not have to worry about growing and selling their produce, but that they could consign it to Basin. Basin would cultivate the field. There would be this entity Basin would take care of it and not take any profits and just pay it out to the workers. Okay. So the first question is, what is a Shemitah Esrog? When is an Esrog a Shemitah Esrog? Is it a Shemitah Esrog when it is harvested in the 7th year? Or is it a Shemitah Esrog when it grows in the 7th year? Even if it starts growing in the 7th year, or let's say it starts growing in the 6th year and is harvested in the 7th year, is that a 6th year Esrog or is that a 7th year Esrog? What if it starts growing in the 6th year and is harvested in 7th year and is harvested in the 8th year? Is that a 7th year Esrog or an 8th year Esrog? That's one question that has to be undertaken, and it'll affect what type of Esrog we're allowed to or not allowed to take. Another problem is that it's forbidden to stockpile Shemitah produce. So I mentioned that we could get around that if we used Otzar Basin. That's one thing that Otzar Basin can help surmount. But number 3, it's forbidden to engage in commercial trading of Shemitah produce. So how can a moicher sell arba minim? How can he sell an esrog? And they sell an esrog for a lot of money. We're not talking about, just give me the cost of the harvesting of the esrog. That's absurd. You don't pay $60 for an esrog, or that's actually not realistic anymore. You don't pay $100 for an esrog to pay for the guy who picked the esrog. That's really just simply not true. Number 4, you're not allowed to take Shemitah produce out of Eretz Yisrael. That was one of the things that we learned in one of our shiurim on the laws of Shemitah. What right do they have to remove Shemitah produce and take it out of Eretz Yisrael? And finally, number 5, how do you legally dispose of Shemitah Esrogim if, let's say, you figure out a way to get your Shemitah Esrog? What are you going to do when it's time to get rid of it? Can you make liqueur out of it? Can you take cloves and stick it into the Esrog like you do and make it into a deodorizer and things like that? So let's take a look at a few things. The Rambam in source number 1 tells us that Hayerek b'sha'as likitaso, that vegetables are judged as being part of the Shemitah year if they're harvested. In other words, you look at the time of harvest, not at the time of planting. The ha'esrog afilu hu kapul kodem Rosh Hashanah v'nase kikikar b'shvius chayev b'maisros keperoshishes. So what the Rambam is going to describe for us is that the esrog occupies a unique category of produce. The rabbis attached to the esrog, and it's not clear exactly why, at least from the Rambam, that's a much more in-depth discussion, why the esrog has both the qualities of going according to when it grew and when it is harvested. So he says, even if it only grew to the size of a bean, you planted it towards the end of the 6th year, or the tree grows, I should say, and you only have the size of a small little esrog, the size of a bean at the end of the 6th year, and the majority of it grows into the 7th year, nevertheless you have to be machmir to treat it as a 6th year esrog as far as its obligation in Trumas and Maasros. Because you're not obligated in Trumas and Maasros during the Shemitah year. Va'afilu haya kekikar bashishis hol v'nilkat bashvius harehu keperos shvius umis aser keperos shishis lahachmir. And even if it grew the majority of its growth, and it was huge by the end of the 6th year, but it's not harvested until the 7th year, you have to treat it as Shemitah produce as well. And therefore you have to give it the chumras of both Shemitah produce and 6th year produce l'chumra. And the same thing would be true if the esrog started to grow in the 7th year and is harvested in the 8th year. The same halacha would be true. So a solution of just harvesting our esrogim after Rosh Hashanah is certainly not going to work, because those esrogim will l'chumra have the status of Shemitah esrogim. And therefore, this is just one sefer out of many who says this. Sefer Shoshanas Ha'amakim says, Lachein, source number 2, Lachein lama'aseh ro'i lilkot esrog lemitzvah basukos shel haschola shenas hashmita od lifnei Rosh Hashanah. It says, therefore, at the beginning of a Shemitah year, if you want to make sure that your esrog is perfectly free from any problems, you should harvest the esrog before Rosh Hashanah, which is typically what was done last year. That wasn't a problem. However, he says, but what about the sukkahs that's after the Shemitah year, which is what's coming up? Then you have a dilemma. You're very limited. You can only purchase an esrog from an orchard that belongs to a Gentile, or from a Jew who observes the laws of Shemitah according to the halacha, or you can purchase it from Otzar Beis Din. In other words, either according to those opinions that says that Yavul Nachari, which we learned about before, that produce that grows on a Gentile's land, according to those poskim that a Gentile can own land in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the laws of Shemitah do not apply to his property, then you'd be allowed to purchase an esrog from that Gentile, or you'd have to take an esrog from a Jew who observes Shemitah, or from Otzar Beis Din. Okay, fine. You'd also have to be very careful in how you deal with that esrog from a financial standpoint, from a mercantile standpoint, because there are limitations. You're not allowed to do business with Shemitah produce. And you'd also have to be careful in how you utilize the esrog after Sukkot, as far as you're limited as far as how you're supposed to deal with it afterwards in disposal and of using it.
What is the second one, a Jew who observes Shemitah?
If a Jew observes Shemitah, then he knows that he's got to leave all of the esrogim in his orchard completely hefker. And he's not allowed to bring them, he's not allowed to hoard them into his home. He's got to leave his field completely open. As we will see, there's a prohibition of locking your orchard and preventing anyone from the outside from coming into your orchard during Shemitah year. If you do that, it prohibits your Shemitah produce even during Shemitah year.
But, I'm sorry, I just want to say, if the esrog grew during the 7th year and the Jew is observing Shemitah,
yes,
the farmer,
yes,
how is he selling the...
Well, he hasn't explained how you're going to sell it. You're allowed to obtain it. That's all he said, is that you're allowed to obtain it from, you're allowed to take it or obtain it from a Jew who observes Shemitah.
Yeah.
How you're going to sell it, that we haven't dealt with yet. The Rambam in Hilchos Shemitah further says, and this is in source number 3, Peiro Shvius ein motzian osan me haaretz l'chutz la'aretz v'afilu l'sur. You're not allowed to transport Shemitah produce outside of Eretz Yisrael. Even to bring it to Syria is prohibited, even though Syria has a quasi-status of Eretz Yisrael because it's part of the territories that David HaMelech conquered. Okay, fine. The rest of the halacha is not relevant to our discussion. Number 4, the Rambam writes in Perek Zayin, he says, Hamolich perush shvius mimakom shekalu lemakom shelo kalu. If a person transports Shemitah produce from a place where they are no longer available to a place where they are currently available, or vice versa, you transport them from a place that has not yet been stopped to be available, and you bring it to a place where it's no longer available. In both of those cases, you have to remove completely the Shemitah produce. You're no longer allowed to have it in your possession. The Ramban says that the obligation to be miva'er simply means that you have to remove it from your house. You cannot keep it in your possession. And surely, if that was the case with an esrog, you'd be in trouble. And we'll skip just to the last line. He says, "Uperos haaretz sheyatzu l'chutz la'aretz misbarim b'makoman v'lo ya'avirei mimakom l'makom." However, if you have produce from Eretz Yisrael which has been transported to Chutz La'aretz, even though it's Assur to do that, but if they have been transported to Chutz La'aretz, then as soon as the Zman Biur arrives, you have to remove them at that very moment, and you can no longer transport them from place to place. You have to just remove it from your house and leave it, and you cannot transport it from place to place. Now, there is a discussion as to when the Zman Biur for Esrogim is. Some people say that if the Esrog grew during Shemitah year, then the Esrogim are still available out in the orchards until Shvat of this coming year. So therefore, there may not be an issue if you hold that the Zman Biur of Esrogim is Tu B'Shvat, like other fruit. But that's not clear to me. It's not clear to me that everyone agrees that the Zman Biur. But, as we mentioned before, if you use the principle of Otsar Beis Din, and you allow Beis Din to take possession of the produce, then Zman Biur is not a problem anymore. So that even if Biur was an issue, even if that the Zman of Biur of the Esrog had already arrived, you would not be required to destroy it. You would not be required to be limited in your movement of it at all. Now let's take a look at the Rambam in Perek Ches in Hilchos Shemitah. The Rambam in Halacha Yud Aleph says, "Kishem sha'asur lasos schara b'peiros shvius o l'shamran." Just like you're not allowed to engage in business activity you can't exchange in a mercantile fashion Shemitah produce. You're also not allowed to hoard it. Kach asur likach me'am haaretz. You're also not allowed to purchase it from a goy. Because if I pay money for Shemitah produce, guess what? That money that I've paid for Shemitah produce obtains the Kedusha of Shemitah.
Am Haaretz, you mean Goy or mean Jew?
And Am Haaretz means a Jew. It means a Jew. He says, Lefi she'ein mosrin d'mei shvius la'am haaretz va'afilo kol shehu shema lo yochal osan b'kedusha shvius. Because maybe the Am Haaretz will not treat it with the Kedusha of Shemitah. And therefore the Rambam writes in the very next halacha, Halokeach lulav me'am haaretz b'shvius, no sein lo esrog matana. If you purchase a lulav, meaning that you're purchasing the arba minim from a goy, and the one species that the Rambam acknowledges is a problem of peiros shvius is the esrog, you should ask the Am Haaretz to give you the esrog as a gift. In other words, I'll pay you for the other 3, whatever you ask. All I ask is that you give me the esrog as a gift, so that we don't have to worry about you taking money that will have kedusha shvius. V'im lo nasan lo, and if the Am Haaretz refuses and he says, no, that's my main source of earning is the esrog. So mavliya lo demei esrog b'demei lulav. Then you have an alternate solution, and as you say, okay, I'm not paying you specifically for the esrog like they do in Eretz Yisrael today. You buy each one of the arba minim separately. There's a table of hadassim, there's a table of aravos, there's a table of lulavim, and there's a table of esrogim. At least there was when I was a bacher, right? So says the Rambam, don't do that. Don't do that because you can't isolate the esrog and pay for it. What you should rather do is have the Am Haaretz package it all up and say how much for the lulav and the esrog together, pay for them together with one, group price, and that way at least you haven't assigned specific monies to have the status of Shemitah. And that would obviate the problem, at least as far as paying the Am Haaretz. Now, what is this all based upon? Where does the Rambam get many of these halachas? So this is really based on a Mishnah in Maseches Sukkah. The Mishnah in Maseches Sukkah, it's on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Aleph in the Gemara, says, Halokeach lulav mechavero bashvius nosein lo esrog b'matana. That if you purchase a lulav from your friend, and here the Meforshim understand that you're purchasing it from a chaver who's an Am Haaretz, which is a little bit strange, the language, because usually chaver means a Talmud Chacham, but mechavero over here means a person who's you don't completely trust, is going to be careful about the monies of Shemitah. No sein lo esrog b'matana. You should ask him to give you the esrog as a gift. Lefi she'ein rashai lelokcho b'shvius, because you're not permitted to buy it. So the Bartanura over here says b'shvius, sha'am haaretz chashad al shvius, because an ignoramus is suspect of not observing the laws of Shemitah properly. Unihi de demei lulav yacholiten lo lefi shalulav eitz ba'almahu ve'ein bo kedusha shvius. He says, I will grant you that the lulav is not a problem. Now, you could argue not that way. You could argue that a date palm, since the date palm produces dates, then perhaps the auxiliary portions, the heart of palm, which is what we call a lulav, may be considered to be ancillary to the date, and therefore, just like the date is considered Perush Shvius, the other auxiliary portions of the date palm have a din of Perush Shvius as well. But both the Rambam and the Bartanura say explicitly that the lulav has no Kedusha Shvius. He says, Demei Esrog ena yocholiten lo. He says, therefore, you can pay for the lulav. That's not a problem. The problem is paying for the Esrog. Shepero shvius tzrichen lihispara b'shvius heinu demein. He says, because you're required to destroy or eliminate produce of Shemitah, plus the money of Shemitah also has to be, anything that's exchanged for Shemitah produce has to be eliminated in the same way. Hilkach tzarch sheyikach mimenu ha'esrog b'matana v'lo yitein lo damav shem lo yivarim am haaretz b'kedusha shvius. And therefore, you've got to make sure that you do whatever you can to get the Am Haaretz to give it to you as a gift, or at least through Havla'ah, like we explained. And so that's rule number one. What we're going to see is that even using the principle of Otsar Beistin as a precaution for this Mishnah, when you purchase your Arba Minim from your mocher, from your seller, you should purchase a set and not purchase an individual esrog from Eretz Yisrael. And even though there's the principle of Otsar Beistin, but Otsar Beistin does still not permit you to engage in commercial trade of Shemitah produce. Otsar Beistin just obviates one issue, and that is, how am I allowed to keep it in my possession and not obligated to eliminate it from my possession after the Zman Biur? So that we've taken care of. By the way, there are poskim who say that Otsar Beistin gives you an automatic heter to also remove it from Eretz Yisrael. That the only isser of removing it from Eretz Yisrael is if it's subject to biur. But if it's no longer subject to biur, then it's also not subject to removal from Eretz Yisrael. That is an extension of the halacha, but there are poskim who say that. So that also could be one factor.
You still can't sell it, though.
But selling it is still going to be a problem.
Even chutzlar.
Even chutzlaretz. So therefore, rule number one is, when you buy it from your moicher, buy it as a set. Do not buy the esrog individually. Now, the Gemara now asks, Lo ratza litein b'matana mahu. What if the Am Haaretz refuses to give it to you as a gift? Amar Rav Huna mafliya le demei esrog belulav. Rav Huna says, all you have to do is buy it as a set. Buy the lulav and esrog as a set, and therefore you're paying not just for the lulav and the esrog individually.
Is that defined by purchase price or selection and purchase price? That is to say, buying for a set is a lump of money. But generally speaking, when people buy buy things, they select what they buy. They're choosing specifically what they buy.
Right. So, whereas, I don't know how the mochrim are going to do it this year, but I would suggest that instead of putting the sticker price on the Esrog, they should put the sticker price on everything else except the Esrog. And then they should say, or they shouldn't put a sticker on anything, because it looks suspicious if they put the sticker on the Esrog. And there's some Esrogim that are marked 60, and some that are marked 100, and some that are marked 150. And if you're not paying for the Esrog, then why is the sticker on the Esrog? So that to me would be a little bit, even though you could argue, well, I'm not really charging you just for the Esrog, I'm charging you for the Esrog plus the Lulav and the Hadassim, and if you buy this, and if you take this Esrog, we'll include a special Hadassim and a beautiful Lulav as well. Maybe that's what the Mocher says, but to me it looks a little bit suspicious.
But you're still paying for the Esrog then, really?
You're paying for, the nicer the Esrog, the more you're going to pay. There's no question about it. There's no question about it.
No, but if you're bundling it, you're still somewhere paying for the Esrog as opposed to saying...
Correct, I understand. So the Gemara is telling you that there's a rabbinic Isser of the of not treating the money with Kedusha Shvius. So if you're mavliya the money, if you group it, if you bundle it together, so then it's not overt that you're being machshil the am haaretz, because you can't clearly identify the money. You're right. There's going to be money in there for the Esrog, but it's not isolated into and of itself. And for the Chachamim, that was sufficient. What the am haaretz and how he's going to treat that money, that's his business. At least you're not directly being machshil the am haaretz.
So here technically from the Muttar, they can say, I'm giving you the lulav, that would be the easiest way, and giving you the Esrog as a Muttar.
Right, but the problem is, then how do we have different prices based upon the quality of the Esrog?
The nicer the lulav, the longer the lulav.
But if the other three are all exactly the same, and the only thing, your point that we'll throw in, better quality of the other three, lends a credence to it. But if the other three are all the same, the only thing that's varying the price
is the Esrog. So I grant you that seems to be a problem. So the Gemara therefore asks, what if the mocher is not interested in giving it to you as a gift? He wants to make money off of the Esrog as well. So the Gemara says, like the Rambam quotes from the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna, Mavliya le demei Esrog belulav. It's very simple. All you need to do is bundle all four minim or the lulav and the Esrog together, and then you pay him for both as a bundled price, as a group price. So the Gemara says, V'leisav le behedja, what's wrong with you giving him the money outright, just for the Esrog? Lefisha ein mosrin demei perush shvius la'am haaretz, because you're not allowed to pay an am haaretz for money for perush shvius. The Tanya ein mosrin demei perush shvius la'am haaretz yoser mimozon shalosh seudos. V'imosar yomar haremos halalu yimuchulolin al perush sheyesh li besoch beisi uba va'ochlan b'kedusha shvius. He says, because if you have Shemitah produce, and the Shemitah produce is being treated as hefker, and the Am Haaretz says, and the Am Haaretz is selling it, and you want to buy it, you can't buy it in large quantities. You can only buy it in small quantities. You cannot give him more than the amount of money that it takes to buy 3 meals. And you can give him that money, and he can give you the Shemitah produce in exchange, even though the Shemitah produce is technically Assur, as long as you treat that money with Kedusha Shvius. If, however, you feel that the Am Haaretz is not going to treat that money with Kedusha Shvius, you should say, Harei mos halalu yimuchulalan al perush sheyesh li besoch beisi. Then the money that I've given to the Am Haaretz should be, even though it has Kedusha Shvius, I want to transfer the Kedusha of that money onto produce that I have in my home that's currently not Shemitah, and I will treat that produce as Shemitah produce. Ubava ochlan b'kedusha shvius. But that's only true if you're buying from an Am Haaretz who treated his field as hefker and allowed anyone to come on. And now that you're coming on and you want to pay him, you can pay him, but that money is treated as Shemitah, as Kedusha Shvius. But if you purchase Shemitah produce from an Am Haaretz who has locked up his field, who has obstructed other people from having access to his field, then what's the halacha? Then afilo b'kachatzi isar assur, then you can't even give him a small coin. In other words, Chazal made a further knas. They said that if the Am Haaretz is not observing the laws of Shemitah and he's obstructing people from coming onto his field and he's not treating his produce as Shemitah, then you can't even give him a penny for his produce. Then he has to give it to you as a matana. So the only time that this heter will work is when in other words, of giving money to an Am Haaretz, is when he's treating the peiros as hefker and treating them as Shemitah. But if not, you can't pay him anything at all. So therefore, it seems like from the Gemara that this solution will work, even because the whole thing is rabbinic to begin with. And if this works, then this would be an alternate solution when in a situation where the mocher is not willing to give you the esrog as a matana. Now, there's an issue that there's a big machlokus between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam in this regard. But we're going to learn like Rashi, who says that even when a Jew obstructs people from having access to his Shemitah produce, you're still allowed to consume that Shemitah produce. In other words, it doesn't automatically become Assur. It just becomes Assur for you to pay him money for it. If a Jew does not observe the laws of Shemitah, his Shemitah produce is not Assur. If he gives it to you as a matana, you're still allowed to consume it according to Rashi. Rabbeinu Tam disagrees, but we're going to learn like Rashi for now. One other small piece of Gemara, and this is a Gemara in Psachim Daf Nun Beis. Tanu Rabbanan, Pero Shiyatsu Me Eretz Yisrael L'chutz La'aretz Misbarin B'chol Makom Shehem. That if you have produce that leaves Eretz Yisrael during the Shemitah year, it has to be destroyed when the time of Biur arrives. You have to eliminate it wherever it is. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Yachzaru l'makomon v'yisbaru mishum shenemar ba'artzacha. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar disagrees, and he says, no, you have to return the Shemitah produce back to Eretz Yisrael and then eliminate it. Now, this is going to be a big issue. If I get an esrog from Eretz Yisrael transported to Torornto, when it's time for me to eliminate it, let's say the Zman Biur for Shemitah Esrogim is not until Shvat of this coming year, or whenever it is, do I have to return the esrog back to Eretz Yisrael in order to fulfill Reb Shimon ben Elazar's halacha? So the Rambam paskins like the Chachamim. The Rambam paskins like the Chachamim and says no. You can fulfill biur b'chol makom shehem wherever they are. And that's the policy of the OU, it's the policy of the Star K, it's the policy of all major poskim in Chutz La'aretz, that you're not obligated to return the Shemitah produce to Eretz Yisrael at the Zman of biur. But what that means is that there are some poskim who are machmir, and that what boils down to is that there are those people who will use an esrog from Eretz Yisrael, and will be makpid to ship it back after Sukkot to Eretz Yisrael. But that is a chumrah. Yes, Reb Shmuel.
The question, though, is there such a thing as one biur for esrog? Because the whole time of biur is not available to the animals in the field. But since the esrogim stay on the tree from year to year, what's the zman biur of an esrog of Shemitah?
Yeah, that's a good question. I read somewhere, I don't remember where, that there is this man biur even for esrogim, but it's not until Shavat of the 8th year. So I register your question, and I don't know that I necessarily have a good answer to it, but that's what I've heard. I've heard that that's what people are arguing. Now, also remember that if you use Otzer based in, as we started off the shiur with, there's no requirement for biur. There's no requirement for biur at all. However, you still have to treat the esrog with kedusha shvius, which means that after Sukkot is over, you would not be allowed to do certain things with it which would alter or destroy the produce, even the peel. So I've read that sticking cloves into the esrog would be problematic this year because you're harming or damaging the esrog without consuming it. You would be allowed to eat the esrog if you wanted to. You might even be allowed to make liqueur out of the esrog as long as you use it as a food item. But if you're not interested in doing that, and even if you are, what are you going to do with the peel and so forth? You'd have to do what you do with all perosh shvius that you want to discard, or the peels of perosh shvius, which is to put it in a separate bag, wait for it to decompose to the point where it's no longer edible, and only then discard it. Yes?
How would the local supplier get around the problem of doing a financial transaction on their Esrogim? Because they're not buying it with the lulav. They're probably buying a crate of Esrogim, right? And then paying for just that.
So, as a matter of practicality, I don't know what kind of financial arrangement is made between the farmers of the Otzar Basin and the people who transport it. Really, they're really only allowed to make money, or not even make money, just recoup their costs of transportation and labor. They're not allowed to make a profit off the esrog itself. Whether that's done, I cannot tell you for sure, but one would certainly expect the esrogim in Eretz Yisrael to be much less expensive this year. So I haven't done all of my homework yet, but we're just going through the sources in the meantime.
Is there a chiyuv of kedusha shvit after Zman Bir?
Is there? Yes. The peiros still have kedusha shvius after Zman Bir. The kedusha shvius doesn't leave them after Zman Bir. There's an obligation to remove it from your house. It has to be, according to the Ramban, that simply means you can no longer keep it in your house. It has to be placed on your doorstep. But it still has kedusha shvius.
There's nobody who holds that it does that kedusha shvit?
I don't think so, unless you show me something that I'm not aware of. There's a lot of intricacy within these laws. Now, there's an early tshuva from the early 20th century, or actually late 19th century, from what is quoted from Rabbi Moshe Yehoshua Yehuda Leib Diskin, who was the Av Beis Din of Brisk. And he is quoted in the Sefer Tzitz HaKodesh from Harav Yoshua Tzvi Michal Shapira, who was a Yerushalmi, and he was a posek himself, and wrote the Sefer Tzitz HaKodesh. And he has a very long tshuva on what to do, what people who want to sell esrogim from Eretz Yisrael should do during a Shemitah year. This is a new phenomenon because it's really this is now when you have enough Yidden in Eretz Yisrael who want to be able to make parnasa off of esrogim. So this is the question. So really the first paragraph, which is all we're going to see today, is where he quotes Rav Diskin, and then the rest of the tshuva launches into an analysis of everything that Rav Diskin has said. We're just going to see the first paragraph today. He says, "Atan nedaber ketzas lefi ani yasdaiti b'dvar hashe'ila sheshalu socharei ha'esrogim." He says this is a question that esrog merchants have asked. Lahoros lahem ketzad yisnahagu b'shana zu b'inyan schora u'v'inyan lahotziam l'chutz la'aretz. How should the merchants conduct themselves in doing buying and selling and transporting the esrogim to chutz la'aretz? So he says, "V'roisi b'tshuvas kvod kedushas moranenu gaon Yisrael u'kedusho moharenu harav Moshe Yoshua Yehuda Leib Zatzal Diskin shaya av Beis Din Brisk. Shahora lahem es haderech yelchubo," and he told us what to do. Ki betziruf ha'esrogim yishluchu gam badei hadas v'yavliu demei esrog bahadas. So the first thing he says is that do not send esrogim on their own to chutz la'aretz. Send esrogim together with hadassim so that whoever is buying them, whether it's the wholesaler, the middleman, or whoever is buying them, should buy them as a bundle purchase, and the hadas is not subject to kedusha shvius. V'hagam de besuk amrinan mavliya demei esrog belulav. He says even though a lulav is offered as the item that's used for havla'ah, for a bundle sale, mikol makom hashas mukila belulav barshis shenichnas bashvius. He says, but the Gemara says that that's actually a lulav that grew in the 6th year. There may be problems with the lulav that grew in the 7th year, and that too may have kedusha shvius. V'lachein ata dekaiminon b'shvias hanichnas lashminas lesela eitzazu. And therefore, since you'd have to be sending an esrog that grew in Shemitah together with a lulav that grew in Shemitah, it could be that the lulav has kedusha shvius because it's part of a date palm. He says, "Va'af sheyesh dvarim begav lahakel." Even though you could argue that a lulav does not have kedusha shvius, even if it grows during Shemitah, ki harambam zal beperish hamishnaya sukkah sham kasav the belulav eino noeg shvius klal dehu eitz ba'alma v'chein etik harav. He says, because as we learned in the Bar Tanura, and that's what the Rambam says as well, that a lulav is eitz ba'alma, it's just a piece of wood, and therefore it has no kedusha shvius. He says, mikol makom lahavliya bahadas adif tfei. He says, but with the hadas, you certainly don't run into problems because a hadas is not part of a fruit tree. And so therefore it's for sure not a problem. It's a myrtle branch, and therefore surely it has no kedusha shvius. Zehu mashenogeya le'inyan isur schora. So that's going to circumvent the problem of selling esrogim that grew during a Shemitah year. That'll solve that problem. So when you send your crate from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, and the middleman wants to buy that crate, he's paying for a package of esrogim and hadassim together, and therefore it's not Assur. Okay? However, now what about transporting them from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, which we learned is Assur? You're not allowed to transport Peiros Eretz Yisrael from a Shemitah year to Chutz La'aretz. He says, Kiyasu tanai meforash im hanochrim ba'alei haganos hamochrim lahem. So now automatically you see that the Maharil Diskin is talking about a different mitzias from what we have today. He's talking about where the orchard owners of the Esrogim are Gentiles. They're Arabs. And you want to buy crates of Esrogim from Arabs. This is written in the late 19th, early 20th century, where the primary growers of agriculture are the Arabs. And you want to buy a crate of Esrogim from the Arabs in Eretz Yisrael and ship them to Chutz La'aretz. So he says, if you buy the Esrogim while they're still in Eretz Yisrael or when they're still on the tree, so then they're going to have Kedusha Shvius inhering in them. And therefore he says what you should do is as follows. He says, Kiyas, what? So he's saying that it could be that if you buy them, even when they're in Eretz Yisrael, and let's say for argument's sake, he's saying make sure that you don't buy them while they're still in the orchard. But he's saying even further, buying them when they're, you see, if you buy, he's arguing like this, if they're being bought from a goy, they still may have Kedusha Shvius. Because there are poskim who say that the orchard of a goy still has Kedusha Shvius. So I have a prohibition of transporting peiros that have Kedusha Shvius to Chutz La'aretz. So what am I supposed to do? He says, Kiyasu tanai meforash im hanochrim ba'alei haganos hamochrim lahem she'enam konim ha'esrogim mehem ki im bevo'am litriest. That what you should do is that you're not buying the esrogim from the goyim who own the esrogim until they reach the port of Trieste, which is in Italy, which was the main port in Europe that connected to the Mediterranean. The objective of transporting the esrog to Chutz La'aretz is to give it as a gift to someone who will also purchase together with it a myrtle branch. Ad kan tochen devarav. Okay, so the rest of the tshuva of the Tzitz HaKodesh is to expand on this. But this is what, so this tshuva was written already at the turn of the 20th century, when now agricultural items were being exported from Eretz Yisrael for the first time, including esrogim. We haven't yet touched on whether this is a preferred activity or not. And before we get into Rav Moshe's tshuva, what I want to do with you is to take a look at a very short letter from the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish was asked in a very, very short tshuva, which you can find in the very famous Sefer Arba'as Aminim HaShalem, which is sort of an encyclopedic work on the Arba Minim that was published earlier in the 20th century. It's in source number 12. It says, Miksav Yad Moran HaChazon Ish Zal, Be'inyan Mishloach Esrog Sheyesh Bo Kedusha Shvius L'chutz La'aretz. The Chazon Ish says, Shalom. Achar Divrei, after all of these salutations, or Michtavo Higiani, your letter has reached me, Lishloach Esrog Bilti Morkov Bilti Mishumar. He says the question is, can you send an esrog that was not morkav, that was not grafted, because that was a big issue all over the world. You have to make sure that the esrog is free from grafting, and ubiltim mishumar, and it was treated with kedusha shvius, and it was not isolated and locked up so that the laws of Shemitah were violated. L'kiyum mitzvah b'makom sheyesh lihistabek sheyivutal ha-mitzvah beheder ha-mishloach. Look at the conditions that the Chazon Ish places on being allowed to send it to chutz la'aretz. If it's for the purpose of the fulfillment of the mitzvah, that if you don't send it there, there's a fear that the mitzvah will not be performed because they won't be able to find it anywhere else. Hadas nota lahatir. Then it seems that it would be permitted. That hadas note lahatir. He says logic leans towards being lenient. V'lo likach min ha'os eschar, provided that you don't buy it from someone who's making money off of it. So look at what the language of the Chazon Ish is. Language of the Chazon Ish is that it's okay, provided that you're sending it to a place where if you didn't send it to, they would have no other alternative, or they would possibly have no other alternative. And number two, you have to make sure that the person who's selling it is not going to make money off of it. So the Chazon Ish is very limiting in his heter. And we're going to see, what I want to be able to explore with you next time is the tshuvas from Reb Moshe, which is the basis for being matir legamre, for being completely matir, purchasing esrogim from Chutz La'aretz and from Eretz Yisrael. And Reb Moshe says it is preferred to do that. He says at the end of this tshuva, yesh lahader likach esroge Eretz Yisrael yoser mishel sha'ar mekomos k'she'enu morkovim k'moshe mahadrim b'chol hashana. You should be mahader to buy peirot arba minim from Eretz Yisrael, provided that you know that they're not from a morkov orchard, from an orchard that has a grafted seed. Okay, because that was a big problem at one point. Presumably, that problem has been alleviated over the years. And we'll see why. We'll see what Rav Moshe's svara is. We'll also see Rav Sternbach also is matir, even though he acknowledges the machmirim. We haven't yet really completely seen, at least what we've seen. Let's just review what we've seen up until now to see how many of the questions we've answered. We've definitely defined that an esrog that grew primarily during the Shemitah year certainly has kedusha shvius, even if it's harvested after the Shemitah year. So that by Sukkot of this year, even if you were to pick an esrog from a tree after Rosh Hashanah, it would still have kedusha shvius. As far as the prohibition of stockpiling esrogim, we have seen that the only way to obviate that problem would be using either otsar bastin or to purchase an esrog from a Jew who has not been stockpiling his esrogim. But if a Jew has been stockpiling his esrogim, then surely it's not permitted to purchase an esrog from him. The only other alternative, he would have to give it to you for free. And then we saw that giving for free means that he can give it to you for free as long as, if he wants to charge, he can, as long as he's charging you for the myrtle branch or for the lulav that is accompanying the esrog. And again, it has to be done in such a way where there's no clear correlation between the esrog and the price. As far as removing the esrog and moving it to chutz la'aretz, the only thing that we've seen so far that permits us to do that is number one, Mariel Diskin says that it has to belong to a goy. And as we'll see in Rav Moshe says, even though normally we don't rely on the heter mechira for allowing us to eat Shemitah produce, we do rely on the heter mechira when it comes to allowing us to consider this to be a Gentile transporting the produce from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, and a Jew will not take possession of it until it gets to Chutz La'aretz.
Does that mean that the fruit has to exist, owned by the goy in Eretz Yisrael?
Mm-hmm.
So it can't come from a Jewish vineyard, be shipped by a goy.
That's what Rav Moshe initially says. And then he says, and those, we'll see this, and those who don't rely on the Heter Mechira, those who say that Shemitta Bisman Hazeh is Deoraisa and there's no such thing as a Heter Mechira, he says, we can still be makel to allow a Shemitta Esrog to be transported to Chutz La'aretz. Why? Because of that statement of Tosfos that the Maharil Diskin quoted, who said that the only time that the Gemara says it's Assur is if it's for la'achila, if it's for eating. But if it's not to be consumed by a Yid, and it's just going to be sold in Chutz La'aretz, and here it's going to be sold for the purpose of doing a mitzvah with it, so then it would be Muttar to transport it to Chutz La'aretz. I think I'm going to put it on hold for now because there's a lot of overload of information. But if time allows, maybe we'll continue this year and we'll go through Rav Moshe's Tshuvas more carefully. And by that time, I'll try to get more information about, on a practical basis, what our local merchants are going to be doing this year. Okay? Have a good night.